started. The standard S2. This is going to look familiar, hopefully, because hopefully in Algebra 1 you've worked with factoring sums. So some of this will be review and some of it will be a little more involved. But the basic standard, I can solve quadratics by factoring. The extension to that is I can factor quadratics that include complex roots. I can use factoring to solve an area problem or a maximum value problem. Alright, so in Algebra 1 we worked on factoring quadratics. This standard is going to be a review, kind of said that. Plus, we're going to be able to extend this in the next unit to factor any type of polynomial. Our main goal is factoring, or in factoring, is to solve quadratics. So when we factor, our main goal is to actually get to an answer. Not just to factor and leave it that way, but actually to get to some x equals some numbers. When you solve quadratics or any polynomial, you are finding where the graph would cross the x-axis. So when we solve, our answers represent where it crosses the x-axis. We've kind of already talked about that a little bit. Okay, so we, by solving, are finding the x-intercepts. And there are two other names that these values are called. They can be called the roots or the zeros. So any one of those terms refer to kind of the same thing, which is where the two, or where the quadratic would cross the x-axis. Factoring is an essential skill in algebra, mainly because it builds on your ability to take a whole and break it down into its parts, which is actually math in general, and is a skill that a lot of problem solving in real life utilizes. All that said, we all have to be very good at this standard when it's all said and done because it doesn't go away. There are a lot of quirky and weird ways to teach factoring. I will teach two main methods, but if you find another way or learn another way from another teacher, feel free to use it. I can't show them all, but you are welcome to use anything that works. So let's try some without a method to show what we're actually doing. And to start this discussion, we're going to review FOIL. Okay, now FOIL, if you remember back from Algebra 1, the F means first, O means outer, I means inner, L means last. This is what we use to multiply two binomials. And we've been working with this, like when we've done complex number, we've FOILed and we've practiced that. But let's just go ahead and multiply these two together using FOIL. So if we do that, you get 2x squared. Those are my first terms. Outer terms, 4x. Inner terms, negative 3x. Last terms, give me negative 6. So I get 2x squared plus x minus 6 when I FOIL. When you factor, what you're doing is taking the product and finding the two binomials that you had to multiply to get that result. So it's essentially going backwards or unfoiling. Okay, so factoring is coming or having something like that given to you, and this being your answer. So you're going to be backing up the process to get from the answer to the parts that made it up. So we're going to first focus on quadratics for your comfort level, and then in the next unit we're going to look to expand to every polynomial. Alright, so without any method, and this is the method that's usually taught, or the way it's taught in most textbooks, it's just called guess and check. So I'm just going to do two here. Let's start with, I don't know, x squared plus 2x plus 1. And then let's do 3x squared plus 7x plus 2. Now, if we were just doing guess and check, and we knew that, okay, this is my result, like I had up here, and I'm looking for the two binomials that made it up, I'm going to start with two parentheses. And then I'm just going to guess and check and start putting stuff in to see if I was to FOIL, would I get what I started with. So in order to get x squared, I have to be able to multiply these two things to get x squared. So we can probably assume that this is x and x. And then these two numbers would have to multiply with FOIL. If we were going to do the L part, those two things would have to multiply to get number 1. So I'm going to assume that maybe it's plus 1 plus 1. And just to double check, we'd have to FOIL it out in our heads. So x times x is x squared. Outer is 1x, inner is 1x. So 1x plus 1x gives me 2x, which is what I have here. And then 1 times 1 gives me 1. So this one works out. Guess and check usually does okay when you're dealing with small numbers like this and when you don't have a number in front of x squared. The more complicated the numbers or the bigger the numbers are, this becomes very cumbersome. So that's why we have other methods to use. But let's just try it again with this. So I know that this times this, or the term in the first spots in both these parentheses would have to be equal to 3x squared if I multiplied them. So since since 3 is a prime number, I'm going to assume that 1 is 3x and 1 is x. And then I know that this times this has to give me 2. So I'm just going to throw a positive 2 and a positive 1 up there, and then see if it works. So if I FOIL it out, 3x times x gives me 3x squared. My outer gives me 3x, my inner gives me 2x. Well, 3x plus 2x does not give me 7x. So let's switch the numbers. Put a 1 here and a 2 here. Let's try that again. 3x times 2 gives me 6x. 1x, 6 plus 1 gives me that 7. And then 1 times 2 still gives me the 2. So now I've double checked it. So with a guess and check, you do have to go through and check each part in order to make sure that it works. Okay, go ahead and flip. This is where we're going to spend most of the time because this is the method that I use. The nice thing about this method is no matter how complicated the numbers are, you don't have to guess and check a bunch of times. This will get you the right answer every single time that you do it. Okay? So, let's start. The first one, or the first step. If there is a greatest common factor, we're going to start by pulling that out right off the bat. And all that does for us is make sure that our numbers are as small as they can be. The next thing that we do is we multiply A and C together. Okay. And then whatever that product is, find two numbers that multiply to get whatever that is, and add to get B. Now, the A, the B, and the C are all coming from your standard form. Just so you know. Next thing we do is we replace BX with those two numbers. Then we factor by grouping. The first two, then the last two. And we pull out greatest common factor from each grouping. Okay, your factored expression is your GCFs added together and your repeated factor. Now, that's going to make a little bit more sense once we actually walk through a problem together. To solve, you would take each factor, set it equal to 0. Now, the reason that this works is because of, and maybe you want to make a little side note here, because of this property, that A times B equals 0 is true if and only if, that's what that means, if and only if A equals 0 or B equals 0. So if you think of A as a factor, as a parenthesis, and B as a parenthesis, if you're multiplying two parentheses together and it's set equal to 0, that can only be true if either the first parenthesis ends up being 0, because then 0 times anything will be 0, or B, that parenthesis ends up being 0, because again, 0 times anything is 0. So to solve, once you get your two parentheses, then you take each factor, set them equal to 0, and solve for x. Okay, so let's actually do some problems here. Let's look at, I think maybe I get to factoring and solving. Oh, actually, let's do all solving here. Let's start with 6x squared minus 33x plus 15. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is pull out the GCF, if we have one. So I look at all these numbers and I see if there's a common number that would go into or divide into each one of these terms. 3 would divide into each one of these terms, so I'm going to pull out a 3. I'd be left with 2x squared minus 11x plus 5. Now once you pull out the greatest common factor, you can just leave it outside. You don't need to really worry about it at this point, because all that's doing for you is making these numbers smaller. Okay, so I'm going to ignore it from this point on, and I'm going to multiply, because the next step is multiplying your A and your C together. So I'm going to multiply 2 times 5 to get 10. I always put on a little box off to the side. And then I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to get 10 and add to get negative 11. Now, two numbers that multiply to get 10 and add to get negative 11 might be negative 10 and negative 1. Okay, so then you take those two numbers, and we're going to replace that middle term. Now, I'm not changing this, because if I add my like terms back together, I'd get what I started with. So if you can notice here, this kind of looks like the step right before we simplify, like when you're foiling. So this is the first part to unfoiling the problem. And once you get 4 terms, we do something called factoring by grouping, where we group the first two and group the last two. And then you look in each grouping and see if there's a greatest common factor. The greatest common factor in the first grouping would be 2x. X minus 5 would be left over. The greatest common factor in the next one's a little tricky, but the hint that I give you is if the first one is negative, you need to at least pull out a negative. So we're going to pull out a negative 1, because then it changes the sign. Now, just so you know, if these parentheses do not end up being the same, you did something wrong. These parentheses should end up being the same, because your answer are your greatest common factors put together, and once you're going to write down the repeated factor, and that's your answer. Now let's say this is equal to 0. Now in order for us to solve this, because that's the point in factoring, is to get to a place where we can solve, we're going to take each factor and set it equal to 0. Here we get x equals 1/2, because I would add 1 and then divide by 2. And then here I get x equals 5. So those end up being my two answers. Or those are the two places where if I was to graph this function, they would cross at 1/2 and at 5. Okay, let's do one more together. Let's look at, trying to find a good one here. Let's do 5x squared plus 3x minus 2 equals 0. Now, just a little hint. If you're solving and your equation is not already set equal to 0, you need to move everything over and get it equal to 0. So we look for greatest common factor. In this case, there's not a greatest common factor, so we just leave it as is. And we're going to start by multiplying A and C together. So we get negative 10 when we do that. And then we look for two numbers that multiply to get negative 10 and add to get 3. So those two numbers are 5 and negative 2. And then we're going to take those two numbers and replace the middle term. didn't mention this before, but it doesn't matter which way you write it. Like this, the -2 could go first and the 5x could go next. It doesn't really matter. It will end up with the same answer at the end. All right, then we're going to group the first two and group the last two. Out of the first grouping, I can pull out a 5x. I'd be left with x plus 1. And if you're struggling with seeing like what's left over, think of, okay, what would have to be there in order for me to redistribute and get what I started with? That's kind of how I think through it. Or you can also think of it as, if I can pull out a 5x, or what would evenly divide out of both those terms. So 5 and x would evenly divide out of there. So that's my greatest common factor. And then what would be left over if I did divide by 5x on both those terms. That's just another way that you can think of that. Out of the second grouping, I'm going to pull out a -2. Because remember that these parentheses have to be the same in order for this to work. And so my answer would be 5x minus 2 times x plus 1. You put your greatest common factors together in one parenthesis, and then that's just repeated once, because this is a quadratic, so I should only have two answers. And now at the very end, I'm going to take my two parentheses and set them equal to 0. Here I get 2/5, and there I get -1. Now, I usually write my answers just like that with the V in the middle. It just means that you have two answers. It's just a symbol that means the word or. So your answers are 2/5 or -1. Okay. Let's do, well, how am I doing on time? Oh, maybe I'll wait. Let me see here. Okay. So I think that's where we'll end up with, and then we're going to practice this a bunch tomorrow. And maybe we'll start with example 4 tomorrow before we actually get into some of this other stuff. And then your homework video for tomorrow will be on the rest of this standard.